Hello and welcome to Ivory Blush Roses. My name is Lisa. Today we're going to explore 5 more ways of attaching rickrack to a crazy quilt project using simple stitches. If you're new here, this is the 3rd video on stitching rickrack. I'll link the playlist for rickrack videos in the description box below and also a card at the end that you can click on if you want to see more of them. And I'll try and put them all in the same spot so that they're easy to find. I realized on my project that if I kept stitching the rickrack an inch apart, I was going to run out of room because I have about 24 more stitches to go and I was already halfway down my strip. I decided to put these a little bit closer. The ones we're doing today are all super simple and they're not going to take up much space. Let's go ahead and get stitching. I've got my needles threaded up and ready to go. I got a couple of short lengths of thread and we're going to start off with those. The first one that we're going to do, I call it a straight whipped stitch because it looks like it's whipping around the rickrack. So I'm coming up right at the center of one of those arches in the rickrack and we're going to go straight over. And I'm going to come up to the center of the bottom arch. So I'm always going to be coming up on the bottom and going down on the top. This was the 5th most common rickrack stitch that I saw. It's pretty simple. It literally is just a straight stitch that goes over the rickrack. It takes no time at all to get this one done. So that might be one of the reasons that it's such a popular stitch. There's what I call the whipped back stitch when it comes to doing rickrack. Now, like before, I basted these on, but if I was putting rickrack on the crazy quilt, remember that I would be burying the ends in a seam, and at some point I will be showing that in this series. For the next one, we're going to be doing another one that was pretty common. I think it came in at number 8 on the list. And that's a stitch that's going to go just straight up and down. Now I could choose to go up and down at every one. And I might do half of this one way and half the other way just to save space and make this go a little quicker. So here I am doing every point. Then let's try doing it where we're only doing it on one side. So I'm going to come all the way over to the next point and we'll see the difference there. I saw it both ways. So there we are. That's just a super simple straight stitch. Easy, really fast. Let's do another straight stitch variation, but this time we're going to make little fans out of it. I'm going to start off with a straight stitch like we just did. And when I'm doing one like this, I always like to do the center one first. We're just going to make little 3 straight stitch fans. Now you could do 5 stitches or 7 stitches. Some of it's just going to depend on your rickrack, how big it is, and how much space you want it to take up. But we're just going to do 3 on this one. I think we're just going to go straight across. You could always alternate them back and forth. So let's start with just this simple version and then maybe the second half we'll do an alternating. Very simple stitching, just straight stitches. And that's got a really nice effect. I like this one. This would be another good one for really opening up possibilities of what you could do with it. Really nice and neat. And the nice thing about stitching in rickrack is you automatically have a guide of how far apart your stitches are. Alright, should we try it where it's alternating? Let's do that. So this time every point is going to have this little fan on it. One of the things I like about doing a sampler like this is that now I'll have a reference for these. So if I want to think about a particular stitch in an area, I can come back and look at this and see how something worked and did I prefer something different. And that's especially trying two stitches that are very similar, just slight variations on the same stitch. That makes this nice and easy to see. And I can tell you right now, I prefer it on the single side. But that's my personal preference, and even though I may prefer something, I often find that you get in a particular situation and you find a use for the one that you thought you didn't like. So it's good to play and have fun with it and just see what comes. You think of small variations you could do, and you can try them out without worrying about having to redo something if it doesn't work on your project. Isn't that the way it always goes? You almost get to the end and you can't quite finish. I need like just a couple more stitches, but you gotta leave room to make that knot. It helps if you put a knot in your thread. There we are, two variations on straight stitch fans on rickrack. I think this one would be better on a larger rickrack where they were spread out a little bit. But I really like both of them and I think I could use those a lot. The straight one, I don't know if I've ever actually used this, but I have used this one and I've seen that used in lots of fun ways. For the next two stitches, I wanted to try a very simple running stitch. When we were doing French knots in a straight line, I had trouble making a straight line. I'm just going to take my air disappearing because I know it comes off of cotton really well, and I'm just going to draw a line right down the center. Even drawing it with a pencil, I can't get a straight line. We're close enough. This one we're just going to do a simple little running stitch straight through, and I think it's helpful to have a plan. So my stitch needs to come straight in the middle of the points as I go, so it's stitch, 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 or it needs to come on the halfway in between. We're going to go in the middle of the points here. I think that's going to look a little bit nicer. This is a pretty narrow rickrack. It's a little less than 1/4 of an inch, and so I don't have quite as much space to work with. So again, this might be easier or it look nicer on a little wider piece of rickrack. But I think with running stitch, when you're crazy quilting, you can weave other fibers through the running stitch and get some really interesting effects. So we might try that with part of this. Not sure if we're going to do that today or on another occasion. A little bit off my line there, I think. Try doing a scoop stitch. So I wonder if I can get it straighter if I'm doing that. Maybe. It does take a little more effort. So if I was crazy quilting and had more layers to go through, that method might be a little bit harder. I think I keep my stitches more even lengthwise when I'm doing stab stitching. Yeah, I like it better when I'm not scooping it, but that's why we're playing. Figuring those little things out. One more to go. On this one, we're going to do it so it follows the path of the rickrack. Same type of running stitch, but we're going to move with that. So I'm going to have stitches not just on the points, but on the rise and fall. because of the size of my rickrack. These are a little bit smaller stitches. I'm actually really liking this one a lot more than I was expecting to. So I'm just focusing on staying in the center of the rickrack as I go, and that's working out pretty well. And I'm stab stitching this one all the way across because I didn't like how the rickrack puckered when I did the scoop stitching, where when you're stab stitching the stitch seems to sit better on top of it. So stab stitching basically means that I'm stabbing straight up or straight down like that. So that's a down, this one's an up, so that the needle is always perpendicular to the fabric. Last stitch. So there's our running stitch that goes along the curves of the rickrack. I actually really like the effect of that one. I think it's quite interesting. Now I'm thinking, because those running stitches would be so good to weave something through, let's grab some thread and try doing a little bit of weaving through. I think that might be interesting. We've been joined by Mushu, who just has to be near. I went through my thread. I settled on this one. This is actually a Kreinik. It's a 1/16 inch ribbon. When I'm using these fancy threads, for a needle, I'm going to use a chenille needle. You want a big-eyed needle for this because it's a little thicker and fancier. And I don't want to use lengths that are real long. I'm going to go, I guess, about 14 feet. 14 inches. I am going to put a knot in the end. We're going to do this on the second half of this. So I'm going to come up on the inside loop and we're going to weave through. If you have a tapestry needle, which is usually used for cross stitch, that needle works pretty well on this too because it's got a blunt tip rather than a pointy tip. I'm going to thread using the back side of my needle and we're going to just go underneath each of those running stitches. Now don't pull it too tight. We can always adjust the tension later. And I'm trying to make sure I'm not going through the thread. I want to go between the thread and the rickrack. Poking myself with the sharp tip of this chenille needle, so a tapestry needle, if you have one, would definitely be the better way to go. I just used what I had handy. Before I tie my thread off, I want to adjust that a little bit. The interesting thing is when you've got the stitches where I have them, it sort of blocks the rickrack. You don't see the rickrack any longer. I think I like it a little snugger than what I have it, with it going in this manner. So I'm just going to pull that through. And you want to pull it as evenly as you can, unless you want the uneven look. Like we talk about so much with crazy quilting, there really are no rules. What do you want with it? So that's an interesting effect. So I think if I was going to do weaving through with that running stitch, I would put my running stitches in the rise or fall rather than above or below the points, and you could follow depending on which way you did it. You could either loop it off or keep it on the rickrack, and you'd see the rickrack better. This, I think you lose the rickrack a little bit, but it definitely adds a little bit of interest to that. I think this is a little bit big for these tinier stitches. So I'm wondering, I have this. Metallic threads can be really notoriously difficult to stitch with. But what if we took just a single one and went along there? Well, that's what we're doing. We're playing, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to play with it and see what I like. Anytime you're working with metallics or fancy fiber threads, keep your length short. We say no rules, but there are guidelines that will help you along the way. Do I want to do 2 strands? I think 2 strands would show up better, so let's do 2 strands. And I'm going to use my chenille needle again. Knot in the end. Alright, let's start about the same spot. I'm going to actually come up in the rickrack here on this one. Like we did down here with this whip stitch, I want to sort of whip around those little running stitches. I came out on the top, and so I want to do that each time. So I'm going to thread them from bottom. And we're just going to do that. And so I think with this one, the running stitch is going to sort of disappear under the metallic thread. I'm not pulling it too tight. I still want to see some dimension with it. This is definitely a less stressful way to add metallic threads to a project without having to actually embroider with them. I can't see because the thread is in the way. And I'll come back at the end like we did with the other one and adjust. Make sure our threads are all even and that the tension is where I want it. I'm looking at this and thinking I probably should have tightened some of this up just a little bit as I went. But I think it's coming out okay. There we go. So there we've just whipped that metallic through the running stitch. You almost can't see the running stitch at all, but that gives a real different effect. I think this was a fun experiment. You can definitely see lots of possibilities from things like this. So I'm real happy with today's experiment. I think we had some fun with some really simple stitches and tried a little bit of fancy stuff with those simple stitches. I think for me, my favorites of the day, I really love this running stitch through here. I didn't expect to like it so much. And I also really like these straight stitch fans when they're done just one direction. Really love that. Well, thank you so much for coming along with me today. I hope you've had fun stitching rickrack on using some really simple embroidery stitches. And then maybe playing around with a little bit of thread weaving to embellish those. Thanks for watching. Happy stitching. I'll see you in the next video.